All right, John, you ready to get started?
Ready?
Excellent. I'll let you take it from here, Don.
Thank you very much, James. I appreciate your help thus far. So this evening, folks, on behalf of Charles Pellegrin, the president, officers, and board members, I want to welcome you to this plenary session of the Louisiana Historical Association. And so I'm greeting you from Southern University here in Baton Rouge on the bluff overlooking the mighty Mississippi River. And just for your information, today is the 143rd anniversary of the founding of this institution, Southern University, dating back to 1880 and moving to Baton Rouge, our present site, in 1914. Now, this evening's session promises to be informative, thought-provoking, as we're engaged in the much less well-known workings of the domestic slave trade in the US. That, of course, sent tens of thousands of enslaved African Americans from the Upper South to the cotton and sugar fields here in the Deep South. Historian with us today, Dr. Joshua Rothman, in his powerful book, The Ledger and the Chain, shares with us the shocking story of the horror for the millions who were enslaved. This book traces the lives and careers of three men who built the largest and most powerful slave trading operation in American history. Those men being Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard. Dr. Rothman argues that their work helped fuel the growth and prosperity of the United States itself. Dr. Rothman has been a faculty member of the Department of History at the University of Alabama since 2000. Presently, he serves as professor and chair of the department at the University of Alabama. Dr. Rothman earned his bachelor's degree from Cornell University, his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Virginia. Besides The Ledger and the Chain, Dr. Rothman is the author of Reforming America, 1815 to 1860. Also, Flush Times and Fever Dreams, a story of capitalism and slavery in the age of Jackson, and of course, several other books. He's the author of numerous journal articles, the list of which is so extensive, I had to stop my printer to keep it from overheating. So I'm pleased and excited to have Dr. Rothman join us this evening to discuss The Ledger and the Chain, a book I will tell you that evoked in me every possible bit of emotions. A book that Annette Gordon Reed says, and I quote, should be read by all who are interested in our current racial predicament. Now, please note that as participants, you may pose questions or comments in the chat function. Dr. Rothman, it was great to be able to talk to you on yesterday. Welcome to this evening session of the Louisiana Historical Association.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I appreciate that.
We're ready for you to talk to us about The Ledger and the Chain.
Well, I hope mostly that that you all will be talking to me and having questions and some conversation about the book. I really would like to just sort of give a sort of basic introduction and kind of an overview of what the book does, and then maybe take some questions from you, and then we can sort of throw it open to the audience. Really, as you described, the book is partially a group biography of Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard. It traces the courses of their lives. It, like most biographies, there is a bit of a womb to tomb element of things. I'm interested in their backgrounds, their families, where they came from, why they got into the domestic slave trade, sort of how they built their business, what their business looked like, and then why they got out of the business, what happened to them in retirement, what were their family lives like, what was their reception like among other white Southerners and among other Americans, both Black and white. And really, I got into the project because, my last book was about the expansion of slavery to the Cotton South. Particularly in Mississippi, I was interested in sort of how that worked economically, what that looked like socially, what kinds of sort of violence and conflict happened as a consequence of that. And in the course of doing that, I got obviously into the domestic slave trade, the expansion of slavery into places like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana couldn't have happened without the domestic slave trade. There simply was no way to meet the labor demands of white Southerners simply by white Southerners bringing enslaved people with them. And, as I got out of that book and thinking about what I wanted to do for another one, I really sort of had noticed a proliferation of work on the domestic slave trade. If you look at sort of the historiography of the domestic slave trade, there's a lot of it now, but really before about the late 1990s, there was not very much of it. There was maybe a handful of books that talked about the slave trade. And then even as the literature started to grow in the late 90s and the early 2000s, you saw more and more about the slave trade, but very little about slave traders, which I thought was peculiar. I think there are probably reasons for that. Among them, that people didn't want to spend a lot of time with slave traders, thinking about them, looking into their backgrounds and their lives. And I entirely understand that impulse. But I thought it was important to talk not only about what the trade itself looked like, but who were these people who kind of operated this business. It's one thing for us to sort of imagine in the abstract, yes, people being bought and sold. I think there's a lot of focus on things like people being put on the auction block, which is the kind of thing that abolitionists certainly paid a lot of attention to. But I do think there's value in trying to take a look at who the perpetrators of these sorts of crimes and atrocities were. I think they were more important to the evolution of slavery as an institution than we often like to think about. And in thinking about, okay, well, who would you want to look at? I didn't want to just sort of do some sort of broad overview of slave traders as a class. I really wanted to try to figure out, to dive a little more deeply. And in the course of looking at the domestic slave trade, if you read in the literature of the domestic slave trade, there's no way to read too far before you come across the company name Franklin and Armfield. And so Franklin and Armfield as a company is sort of everywhere in the domestic slave trade, but we really didn't know a lot about the men who ran that company. And so that's sort of what got me started in the course of doing this book. But even though I came to it as biography, it became clear in the course of doing the research and started doing the writing that the book wasn't just going to be a biography of three particular slave traders. It became clear in the course of doing it that the story that could be told through the lives and careers of those particular traders really was the story of the slave trade itself. Isaac Franklin is born in the late 1780s. John Armfield dies in the early 1870s. And if you're going to tell those stories over the course of those lives, what you come to discover pretty quickly is that you can tell the entire story of the domestic slave trade in the course of just looking at their lives and careers. And so that's really what the book tries to do. It traces the evolution of the trade, which does ebb and flow over time. It's not something that's steady. It's not something that always operates in the same place, or in the same ways in different places. And so, it sort of follows them from sort of their early involvement in the slave trade, which starts, for Isaac Franklin, it really starts as the transatlantic slave trade closes in the early 1800s. For John Armfield and Rice Ballard, it really starts in the 1820s as they get into it as young men. And their business is put together starting in the late 1820s. It stays in business into the 1830s. But even after they get out of the slave trade business, they are still sort of involved in some ways because they are collecting debts from customers. This is a business that runs a lot on credit. And so you could trace not only the evolution of the financial system in a certain way, but you could also sort of follow these men into their afterlives of the slave trade. And then you, of course, can follow sort of what their legacies are in the slave trade. And really what you start to see is that the kind of business operation that they put into place is something that really transformed the slave trade itself. Before Franklin and Armfield, slave traders tended to be sort of small-time operators. White men might get into the slave trade for very brief periods of time, trying to make a little bit of money, and then they'd get out of it. Franklin and Armfield is really a business that turned slave trading into a profession. It's the kind of thing that after Franklin and Armfield, more and more people got into for the long haul. They create companies that stay in business for years and years at a time, set up in regular cities, regular bases of operation in cities. They're interfacing with the banking and the financial and the commercial systems of the places where they work. And there are more of them. Franklin and Armfield really is sort of the giant of their era. But by the time you get to the 1850s, there are dozens and dozens of sizable slave trade operations that operate a lot like Franklin and Armfield did. And that's really what the slave trade starts to look like until you get to the time of the Civil War, when finally slave trading comes to an end. So that's sort of the overall arc of the book and the trajectory that it aims for. Rather than try to get into sort of particular details of it, I'd be much more interested in hearing what kinds of questions people have, and what anyone who's in the audience would like me to talk about. I think it's possible we may have lost Don here, so I'm going to just read the questions from the chat and we'll go from there. So the first question that I see is how I got into the study of slavery. I don't want to say it was by accident that I got into the study of slavery, but it was not something that I really, I never particularly planned to become a historian of slavery. When I was in college, and sort of first became a history major, I studied with someone who was really a political historian, somebody who studied sort of the evolution of party politics before the Civil War. I went from there into doing sort of an undergraduate thesis on the sectional crisis, which eventually became the Civil War. And then when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, I thought I would do more of that. I thought I would become a political historian. It was something I liked doing. It was sort of what I knew. And then sort of, I actually graduated from college in the middle of the year. I graduated in January. And between January and May, I stayed up at Cornell, really doing temp work, office work. And I had a lot of time on my hands. So what I did with a lot of that time is I read a lot of African-American literature. I'd had a class my very last semester in college in which we were assigned Richard Wright. So I started reading more Richard Wright. I went from there to reading, I read a lot of Alex Haley. I read Roots. I read autobiography of Malcolm X. I read a lot of Langston Hughes. And sort of by the time I started grad school, my interests had sort of started to shift a little bit. I was still interested in the 19th century. I was still interested in the coming of the Civil War, but I had started to develop much more interest in the experience of African Americans in that time frame. And so then I got to graduate school, and then my interest started to move a little bit more. By the time I sort of finished my first year of graduate school, I had written a master's thesis on John Brown. From there, I started moving more and more and closer into slavery. And my first book ended up being about sort of families that crossed the color line under slavery. And so really it wasn't any particular decision. It was one step led to the next step, led to the next step. And 25 years later, I've become a historian of slavery. It's what I do. It's been a sort of interesting career trajectory to end up doing something that you never expected that you were going to do. Let's see. Next question is about who are some of the more prominent associates of these names, especially names that most listeners might recognize? So that's a really interesting question. Some of them are the really obvious ones. So Isaac Franklin, for example, Isaac Franklin was from a planter family in Tennessee. He's from Sumner County, which is sort of northeast of Nashville. And if you go into the Sumner County court records from sort of the 1780s, which is when Franklin's father goes there during the Revolution and then becomes a planter during the sort of post-revolutionary period. And one of the first things I came across when I was looking through the court records was the application from a young Andrew Jackson to be able to operate as an attorney in Sumner County. And so, Andrew Jackson applied to work as an attorney in a lot of different counties, but, the Hermitage is not particularly far from Sumner County. And Isaac Franklin's father, James Franklin, and Andrew Jackson actually were basically contemporaries of one another. Jackson's a little bit older, if I remember right, than James Franklin, but they became colleagues, they became friends. So Isaac Franklin grows up with Andrew Jackson as sort of a family friend. It's a very long story that I won't get into, but there comes a point where Isaac Franklin wants people to vouch for his character. And Andrew Jackson writes a letter that gets published in the newspapers saying that he'd known Isaac Franklin since he was a kid. Always understood him to be a sort of honorable, upstanding person. This, of course, after he's been a slave trader for 30 years. So men like Andrew Jackson, men like Henry Clay was also a sort of associate of Isaac Franklin and sort of knew him. John Armfield, as he gets older, he's sort of out of the slave trade by this point, but obviously everyone knew who he was and how he'd made his money. He becomes very close associates with some of the leading Episcopal bishops in the United States, with Leonidas Polk, with James Odie, who were the bishops for the conferences that took in places like Louisiana and Mississippi. Armfield is involved with the founding of the University of the South, and he gets involved with that because the bishops came to him and they wanted somebody with a lot of business experience to help them out. So those are some of the names of people that everyone, I think, would probably recognize. But I think what's interesting and what really jumped out at me in the course of doing my research is, I went down to New Orleans because slave sale records are probably better kept in the state of Louisiana, more systematically kept in the state of Louisiana than they are anyplace else in the country. And that's because of the notarial system, right? It's a civil law system. And so and enslaved people were considered they were in the category of property the same as real estate was, right? And so many slave sales, most slave sales are not most slave sales outside of Louisiana are recorded under what was known as under private signature, right? It's just a sale that happens between two people. You didn't need to record it in a deed book. Louisiana was different. Louisiana pretty much, if you go into the conveyance records or the notarial records in pretty much any parish, and you look through them for the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you're going to see a lot of slave sales. And so I knew that for New Orleans, where Franklin and Armfield did a fair amount of their business. Most of their business is probably out of Natchez, but there's probably between a quarter and a third of their slave sales are in New Orleans. So when I was in New Orleans, I spent several weeks in the notarial archive, just going through the indices. And just anytime I saw Franklin or Armfield or Ballard or someone who I knew was one of their purchasing agents, anytime I saw that name, I would track down the notarial record, and I would, I basically created the database of about 2,500 slave sales that they did. And what kind of blew my mind, I guess it shouldn't have surprised me, really, but it still did, is how many of those names of their customers were names that I would see, and I would see them in the street names in New Orleans. So many of the streets in the not in the French Quarter, but in places like the Central Business District, were named for prominent slaveholders. And a lot of those names were people to whom Franklin and Armfield sold enslaved people. I saw the name Maroney among their customers. They sold people to the Maroney family. And so, in terms of sort of prominent associates of Franklin and Armfield, prominent associates of Franklin and Armfield were, mostly prominent people in places like Louisiana and Mississippi in the 1820s and 1830s. If there were prominent slaveholders, politicians, bankers, anybody in those sorts of categories, Franklin and Armfield probably did business with them at some point or another. Don, I see you're back. I think you're muted, but you are back.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
So I've been going through the questions in the chat, but if you had any questions for me, you can go ahead and fire them away, or I can keep going off the chat.
Well, listen, one of the things that struck me about these three individuals was there must have been a degree of schizophrenia involved with these people, given the horrors associated with some of the things that were going on, but still trying to maintain some form of Christian presence. I mean, it just amazed me, how under those circumstances they continued to proceed with this for an extended period of time until at some point each of them decided enough is enough.
Yeah, so that's a really tricky thing for me to get my head around too. And it's really the one, ironically, given that it's a biography, right? You want to, you want to try to get inside the heads of your subjects. That was actually one element of this book that I found, I don't think I actually succeeded in trying to figure out what kind of person would decide, right? Because nobody made them be a slave trader, right? No, you didn't have to do that. To not only do it, but to decide to do it for years, every single day for years. And, all I can tell you is that from everything that I read in their business records, in their personal letters to each other, of which there are a fair number, they really liked their business. They liked the power that it gave them. They liked the influence that it gave them with other white people. Honestly, they liked the violence. That some of the stuff that's in their letters is absolutely repellent. They joke with one another about the violence they carry out. They tell dirty jokes about Black women who they sexually assaulted. They really, there's no sense of guilt. There's no sense of remorse after they're done. There's nothing. There's not even a hint where you would think that they're thinking to themselves, I really have trouble looking myself in the mirror. I don't think that crosses their mind for a second. How you reconcile that with going out and being a perfectly respectable white person in society? I mean, they're not the only ones who do that, right? Slaveholders, the only thing that keeps slavery together is violence. Without violence, slavery doesn't work. And so, how do slave traders do it? I mean, how does any slaveholder do it? I don't really pretend to know the answer to that. And there was part of me, I think, that didn't entirely want to know the answer to that. I mean, it takes you, as it is, working on this book takes you to some very, very dark places, and trying to sort of inhabit the mindset that would let that sort of thing continue, where you would choose to do that. I think for me personally, there was only so far I was willing to go.
Well, Josh, I'm looking at a question that says, as a historian that researched and published works on slavery, how do you deal with the horrors of slavery emotionally while you're doing this research?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. It's difficult. I won't lie. It's hard. And I think I actually don't think I entirely understood what it would mean to do a book like this, right? I mean, I figured, okay, I've been thinking and working on slavery, but by the time I started this book for almost 20 years, I'd written several books about slavery. I obviously read extensively in the field. I spent a lot of time in the archives. I've seen some really sort of depraved things that people do to each other. And, I know what the slave trade entails, but I don't know. There were definitely moments where I was really brought up short in the archives. And it wasn't the things you would think, right? Other people have written about Franklin and Armfield. I knew about the letters where they tell jokes at the expense of enslaved people. I knew that was there. That didn't surprise me. I think, there's a way in which when you're doing research in the archive, right, and you're just sort of gathering information about slave sales, it has a way of sort of washing over you, right? Because it's just gathering information. But there are times where you come across, like, it's the little details, right? It's the moment where all of a sudden it strikes you like, wait a minute, they're selling, 10-year-olds, selling them away from their families. Or, information that's in a ship's manifest, right? That records not only people's names, their sex, their however, white customs officials describe their color, and it describes their height. And, you'd see someone recorded in a manifest, somebody who was, 2 years old and 1 foot 11 inches tall. Like, I had a really hard time processing those sorts of things. And I can't say I recommend it. I was very happy when I was finished with this project. The only saving grace for me was that these kinds of things didn't literally haunt my dreams. I did not dream about this project very often, and I'm thankful for it. The only thing that I can say for how I sort of deal with these things emotionally is that ultimately a project like this, when you decide to do it, or when I decided to do it, at least, it wasn't about me, right? It's not about what can I handle as a historian, right? You imagine that whatever you're trying to deal with psychologically, like, to say it's not even a fraction of what the people who actually experienced this went through, that's like the understatement of the day, of a lifetime. It's the kinds of things that people experienced and struggled with and survived in the course of the slave trade. It's unimaginable. And so, there's not really a lot of room for someone like me to be like, oh my God, isn't this so hard for me? Like, compared to what? And so I felt like this was a story that was important to tell. And so, yeah, I mean, it's terrible to sort of to subject yourself to sort of reading and thinking about this every day, all day. But but I guess the way I dealt with it was to remind myself that the stories that I was trying to tell, and ultimately the big picture of what this book might mean for people who didn't know this story was much more important than anything that I might try to experience, which is not to say it was easy or fun. It was not, but I think sort of trying to keep that kind of front and center helped.
Yeah, well, I see Charles is asking whether Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard had ties with prominent Louisiana political figures, slaveholders who may have done business with them or may have provided them with legal financial assistance.
I'm sorry, with prominent political figures?
Prominent Louisiana political figures, yeah. Slaveholders who may have done business with them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of sort of particular names that you would recognize, but yeah, I mean, they both in Louisiana and Mississippi, they are people who are entangled with political officials of various kinds, right? It's anything from, selling enslaved people to the notaries, right? The people whose job it was to sort of record contracts in various parishes. Sometimes it's people who are, presidents of the bank, right? Members of the city council. So yeah, I mean, if you go through the records, they're certainly doing, they sold a large number of enslaved people to, to the mother of one of the governors of the state of Louisiana. So yeah, I mean, they definitely do business not only with people who are leading slaveholders, but people who are both slaveholders and members of the political elite in the city and the state.
Melissa wants to know if slave owners felt they were socially above slave traders. What was the status of people like Franklin and Armfield? Yeah,
so slaveholders sometimes pretended they were socially above slave traders, right? They told people that. It became sort of a part of the defense of slavery against anti-slavery forces to say that, the worst elements of slavery were really the fault of slave traders, that, they took advantage of the financial situations of slaveholders. They, that nobody really dealt with them outside of a business situation, and they really only deal with them when they have to. The worst elements of violence and family separations, all that could be displaced onto slave traders. None of that is actually true, though. The slaveholders, I mean, you could basically, the way things worked is there were sort of, there are many ways to be a slave trader, right? Some slave traders were sort of itinerants, right? Kind of fly-by-night operators. You never knew where they came from. You never knew where they got the people that they were trying to sell to you. You might buy from them, and then you'd never see those people again. And those are people who, many slaveholders do not really want to do business with, and do kind of look down their noses at them. But it's not because they're slave traders. It's because they're sketchy. The reality was the better you were at the slave trade, the more reliable you were, the more likely you were to be in a sort of regular place of business and deal in large numbers of people. The better you were at that, the more established you were, the more likely slaveholders were to do business with you, right? The fact that Franklin and Armfield are sort of entwined with so many leading figures, it's not a coincidence, right? And it's not unique to them. Slaveholders were, they like to pretend that they were above slave traders. They like to pretend that slave traders were sort of social outcasts, but there's not actually a lot of evidence that that was true. Isaac Franklin marries the daughter of one of the most prominent lawyers in Nashville. Rice Ballard marries the daughter of a prominent slaveholder in Northwest Mississippi. John Armfield marries one of Isaac Franklin's nieces, who herself was the daughter of a prominent slaveholder. So, there's just not a lot of evidence to back up the claim that slave traders were sort of social outcasts. I think it's mostly a myth that's a product of the defense of slavery, and then it extends as a myth into the lost cause. And it was a way for slaveholders to tell themselves that what they did was not so bad, that the terrible things about slavery weren't really their fault or their responsibility. It's a very sort of self-serving myth, but it's not really a true one.
Let's see. Josh, your research essentially points to an almost total immersion of the economy of the slaveocracy to the building and continued growth of this nation. Given, and I think we kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday, given these culture wars that we are engaged in now, you feeling a little shaky about soon you're going to be on the screen and be attacked?
I really don't want to be. I hope not. I think that the subject matter is one that is in that sort of cluster of subjects that that there's a lot of pushback about, right? It's in that sort of constellation of things that certain politicians and certain parents don't want their children to know about, and to a certain extent are in the process of getting, if not effectively banned, sort of pushed off to the side in many curriculum. I don't think my book in particular is on people's radar, but it doesn't really matter whether this book in particular is something that people try to stifle. I think it's much more troubling that there seemed to be really a purposeful effort to bury aspects of American history that make people uncomfortable, that make people sort of ask critical questions about American economic development, ask critical questions about sort of the nature of America's founding and how that played out in the generations after the Revolutionary War. And I think that the variations on that story that leave things like slavery out, or that pretend that slavery was, sort of an exception to the rule, right? That the United States was really, it really was sort of about universal human freedom, and capitalism really is about sort of people being able to, kind of pursue their own economic interests in a system of free markets. Everyone can do that, right? To tell that story without understanding the way that slavery is not only happening at the same time as those things, it's part of that story, right? Those two things they're not separable from each other, right? The idea of sort of all men are created equal, that's happening at exactly the same time as the transatlantic slave trade is peaking. right? It's not like the transatlantic slave trade sort of rose in the sort of 1600s and then it's kind of going downhill at the time of the American Revolution. And that's how, you can see a sort of trajectory toward freedom. It's the opposite. The transatlantic slave trade is going up in the 1700s, not down. And so, look, and that doesn't invalidate sort of the ideas of the American Revolution, but it does ask us, I think it requires us to sort of understand and try to disentangle how those things are interconnected with one another. If you don't do that, you don't actually understand the early history of the United States at all. You just understand the version of it that you're comfortable understanding.
So any negative pushback thus far from the book?
For me personally,
Yeah.
I mean, there's an occasional, I get an occasional email. There are certainly, there's always a couple of people who are going to leave a sort of nasty review on Amazon. The book that did get reviewed by the Claremont Review. There's a think tank called the Claremont Institute, which has sort of fashioned itself as giving a kind of sort of, I don't want to say intellectual cover, but fashions itself as sort of the intellectual version of Trumpism, I guess. And they gave it, they sort of trashed it in their review, things like that. And that's okay. That's what I'd expect. I think if you're not getting any kind of pushback, then then you're only speaking to people who agree with you. And I don't know how useful that is. So I anything that I've experienced is really nothing compared to what a lot of other people have to deal with who write about this subject.
Yeah. Well, can you talk a little bit about people who transported or oversaw the transportation of enslaved people from Alexandria to Natchez to Vicksburg and New Orleans? Bill wants to know.
Yeah. So, Franklin Armfield and Ballard, because they are the partners in this business, they are not usually themselves involved in bringing people from point A to point B. They certainly did that over the course of their careers, right? Particularly early in their career, they certainly were very hands-on in that way. But by the time they get up to running a partnership like Franklin and Armfield, they didn't usually do that. They pay people to do that. And they varied in terms of the kinds of people they were. So, Isaac Franklin has several of his nephews are involved in the slave trade business. They're sort of training in the business. And sometimes they're involved in transporting people. Most of the business that Franklin and Armfield does is by ship rather than walking people over land. But they would usually send an agent on board with a shipment to make sure that that people are getting to where they're supposed to go. They have somebody who's responsible for overseeing that.
Yes, and I recall, weren't they also engaged in shipbuilding themselves?
So they commission a number of ships.
Yeah.
Okay. So Franklin and Armfield are really the, shipping people from Alexandria to New Orleans. There are people who did that before them, right? Moving people along the Atlantic coast, right? From Baltimore and Alexandria and Norfolk and places like that. And they go down the coast and around Florida and up the Mississippi. And Franklin and Armfield has eventually end up owning 3 of their own ships. One of which they had already, it doesn't seem like the first one, they actually commission it. I think that ship already existed and they buy it. But the last 2, they seem to have commissioned specially for the slave trade. And they would usually sort of hire people. Sometimes they're people who are, purchasing agents. Sometimes they're just people who work for the company. They might be a clerk. They might work in the office. And where those people came from are sometimes hard to tell, right? I mean, there's one guy I remember who I think started off working as a carpenter, but decides he kind of wants to get into the slave trade. So he goes to work for them. There's another guy who at a certain point had worked for a different slave trader and worked part-time for Franklin and Armfield. Trying to figure out who those guys were is a little bit trickier sometimes because they leave less of a mark in the public record.
Let's see. Somebody says that when you were describing families, that it sounds like a web of elites who married elites.
Well, yeah, I mean, and a lot of, I mean, that was certainly true of a lot of slaveholding families, right? Because you have families that are establishing themselves in the East, in places like Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and sons of those families would then go to places like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and sort of establish kind of the next generation of that slaveholding dynasty. And they do often intermarry with each other. They're then linked back to families in the East. So yeah, there is a sort of, I wouldn't say there's a single network, but there are a lot of overlapping networks of elites who are often intermarrying with each other. That's very true.
See what else we have here. So you mentioned the word Marigny and the Marigny family. Let's see. These are people who, of course, ran pre-Civil War Louisiana, and who apparently had connections throughout the South and the Southeast, and were generally customers of these three guys, I assume.
Some of them are. I mean, look, and Franklin and Armfield are not the only slave traders in the business, right? I mean, there are the more that companies like Franklin and Armfield could demonstrate that there was money to be made, the more attractive it became to other white men to get involved as well. So, Franklin and Armfield is really just one of many slave trading operations that existed. The slave trade effectively operates in any southern city, any county seat, any town, steps of a courthouse, out on a dock somewhere, out in front of a grocery store. The slave trade is really everywhere. Everywhere slavery was, the slave trade was, and Franklin and Armfield are only a sort of tiny fraction of a much larger industry.
Yeah, that brings me to that point again, that you seem to be arguing that this institution, slavery, is essentially, in many ways, the bedrock of the economic development of this nation.
Well, I think that there are sort of soft versions of that argument and hard versions of that argument, right? Yeah. There are people who would go all in on that, right? I don't think that I would argue that slavery is the bedrock institution of American economic development. But what I would say is that a story about American economic development that doesn't account for the role of slavery in producing the leading agricultural commodities of the United States, the leading export of pre-Civil War United States. Enslaved people outside of real estate are the largest asset class in the American economy before the Civil War. They are, valued collectively at between $3 and $4 billion. At the time of the Civil War, $3 to $4 billion was more than the country had invested. If you took banks and real estates and manufacturing, you put it all together, still less than $3 or $4 billion. So but economists will tell you that that's not the whole story. And they're right. It's not the whole story. But I don't think you can, if you tell the story without accounting for the role that slavery plays in it, you're not actually telling the story. You're telling yourself a fairy tale, right? So to me, how exactly you would sort of quantify slavery's role in American economic development, I'm not actually that interested in that. Is it 2%? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? I don't actually care. I don't find, I understand why people want to know. It's not an unimportant question. It's just not a question that I am sort of particularly equipped to answer. And I don't think it's necessarily the most relevant question. I think that the relevance for me is slavery's role is obvious. It's integral. You can't understand American economic development through 1865 without understanding slavery. And certainly, slavery's presence in the American economy is of central importance to people of African descent, right? If you ask the question, you're like, well, what does it mean for the country? Well, that's one question. What does it mean for the economic position of, 4 million enslaved people? From that perspective, it's everything, right? It is the bedrock of that experience. So, I think it really depends on how you're asking that question and what exactly do you want to know?
Someone wants to know if you think the effects of slavery still echo through America in 2023.
Yeah, I do. Again, what exactly that means, that I think probably has a lot of potential answers to it, right? I think it does oversimplify things to draw a direct line from slavery to the present. Right? There's been a lot of intervening generations, a lot of intervening experiences. I don't think that you can say, things like the racial wealth gap, right? You can't sort of point to that and say, well, that's because of slavery. Well, slavery is part of the answer to that question. I don't think it's a direct line from one to the next, right? Because you do that and you're ignoring the impact of things like sharecropping, like tenant farming, like convict leasing, like segregation, like redlining. On and on and on. There's so many other things that contribute to that. But I think all of those other things, in some way or another, each of those things is itself sort of a legacy of slavery and of racial hierarchy. And so, yes, I do think that the right term there is echo, right? Slavery does not sort of linger in like a really specific, tangible way in the United States today. But I do think that it echoes. It's still in there. It's baked into the recipe. There's no way to take it out.
So what's America going to do about reparations for all of those years and all of those hours and all of that toil and blood?
Yeah, that's I get that question a lot. And I actually got it earlier today. So I'll tell you what my answer for it is that look, I'm not a scholar of reparations, right? I don't pretend to have an answer for, well, how would that work? What's the best model for it? How would we calculate, if we're going to do, a wealth transfer, how would we do that? How do we decide who gets what? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't pretend to know the answer to that question. I think that there are lots of other scholars out there who think very long and hard about that question, and they have answers for that question. I think for me, to a certain extent, that jumping to that sort of, how would that work? To me, I feel like that's sort of it's not that it's the wrong question, but I don't think it's the first question, right? I think for me, the issue is that I think we all need to be on the same page of what exactly we're talking about here, right? If you're a person who purports to believe in the values of equality in the United States, if you believe in something that resembles justice, if you believe in capitalism, right? People should be compensated for their labor, right? People should be able to earn a living for themselves based on what they do and what they contribute to the economy. If you believe in those things, then you need to grapple with the reality that historically, in 1865, 4 million people became emancipated. Those people were at the tail end of numerous generations, dozens of generations of people who were also enslaved. None of those people were compensated for their labor. They received nothing for everything that they had done. People not only extracted their labor for profit, but put asset values on their bodies and leveraged that for additional financial gain, all of which reverberated throughout the entire country, all of which was sanctioned by the federal government and by state governments. Is the fact that they got nothing, is that justice? Until we all understand that, and until we all are on the same page and can acknowledge that that was a wrong, that the country never righted, never really even tried to right, until we actually agree on that basic principle, then talking about what do reparations look like, to me, that's sort of a distraction, right? It's an easy distraction. I think for people who are opposed to it, it's easy for them to turn around and say, well, you know, my ancestors didn't own slaves, or what do you do? You know, how do you decide who gets what? Or what do you do about people who are descended from both slaveholders and enslaved people? Like, none of those questions are the right question, right? Do you agree with the principle that reparations are owed to enslaved people? Do you or do you not believe that? And until we all can agree on that, I feel like that discussion is just going to be nowhere productive. But I do think that conversation about that initial principle is one that we've never had, and that I think there would be value in doing that, whether it leads to anything or not.
That is certainly a question that is going to continue to be debated for whoever knows how long. But I think you're correct. It's the process of going through answering that series of questions, if you will. You know, I was looking at some of the articles that you've done, and yesterday we were talking about at least one of them, and you said that in doing this research for the Ledger and the Chain, that you visited more than 30 archives in over a dozen states, from Louisiana to Connecticut. And in the process, you know, you learn that there's so many Americans who apparently do not realize that a domestic slave trade existed in the United States at all. I mean, that's just unbelievable, Doc.
Yeah, it's very peculiar. And that actually was an article that I did get a lot of pushback on. People would write, what are you talking about? Of course people know about the domestic. I learned this in high school. And then there were a lot of other people who wrote, no, I never knew about this, right? And I was genuinely surprised when I was working on this book, that I would tell people what I was working on, and they would start asking me questions about Africa, where in Africa people came from. And I was like, I'm not talking about people from Africa. I'm talking about people of African descent, but they are Americans, right? They're born here. I'm not talking about the transatlantic slave trade. I'm talking about the trade of people within the United States. And once you sort of explained it, it wasn't hard to explain, right? People immediately were like, right, I guess, of course, people were bought and sold in the United States. But I don't think it's something that, for whatever reason, people think much about. I don't think it's things that until at least very recently, people learned much about. You know, the truth is that the scale of the domestic slave trade, you know, the number of enslaved people imported into the 13 colonies and the early United States, right, into mainland North America, it's between 400,000 and 500,000 people, right? That the mainland North America is actually sort of a minor component of the transatlantic slave trade. Far more people go to places like Brazil and the West Indies. Which is not to dismiss it, but it's just to give you a sense of the scale of it. The domestic slave trade, you know, there's you know, more than 1 million people are bought and sold across state lines. Within state lines, there's at least another 1 million to 1.5 million people. Like, the size of the domestic slave trade dwarfs the size of the transatlantic slave trade to mainland North America. And so the fact that the transatlantic trade is what sticks in people's heads, while they seem to know very, very little about the domestic trade, I think some of that speaks to what people learned in school. You know, the images that they have maybe in popular culture, at least until pretty recently. But it was something that genuinely surprised me. When I started this project, you know, having to explain to people what the domestic slave trade was not something that I expected to have to do.
Christopher wants to know, how does the suppression of the teaching of history, particularly African-American history, affect any type of reconciliation?
Well, it doesn't help. That is for sure. And I think what's most troubling to me is that the effort to suppress that history, or to only tell a very sort of tailored and sanitized version of that history, which I think is more common. I think, you know, people will push back and say, we're not trying to take slavery out of the curriculum. We're not taking, you know, segregation out of the curriculum. Well, I mean, if you only really want to talk about like the Emancipation Proclamation, and you only really want to talk about Martin Luther King, you kind of are taking that out of the curriculum, right? I think what's troubling to me is that the insistence on either suppressing or only telling a very sort of sanitized version of African-American history, I don't know, for some people it's purposeful, for other people it's less so, or at least unconscious, but it's fundamentally dismissive of the Black experience in the United States. It's fundamentally dismissive of the family histories of millions of people, many of whom are like your friends, your neighbors, right? Your colleagues at work. To say that you don't want their history taught to your children in its full spectrum, right, is in turn, at least by implication, to suggest that you don't actually care about those experiences. You don't want to hear them. And you know, the question of how does that sort of affect any type of reconciliation? I mean, I think the next step in there is to ask people who want to sort of keep that history at bay, are you even interested in reconciliation? Or are you only interested in reconciliation on your terms, right? And that's not reconciliation. I don't know what the word for that is, but it's not the only way reconciliation happens is if people actually sort of recognize each other's experiences and appreciate them and respect them and give them the space to be told that they deserve. If you can't do that, I don't know what you're interested in, but it's not reconciliation. So I think that's a very long way of saying that I think the suppression of this history, or at least versions of this history, is a way of keeping reconciliation at arm's length. And whether that's purposeful or not, I think that's ultimately where the outcome goes.
So I see someone wants to know, how do we make this information, this valuable analysis, accessible to children and teens in America?
I mean, in the current political environment, it's very, very difficult, right? I think that middle school and high school teachers have a much more difficult job than I have. At least for now, I can mostly teach and say what I want. I can assign whatever readings I want. I can't make my students believe anything, and I don't pretend to. I'm not interested in making them believe things, but I can expose them to things, and they can lead them down whatever road they choose to go on. Middle school and high school teachers are having those options increasingly constrained, depending on what state they're in and what school district they're in. I think that I don't think it should be the responsibility of individual parents to teach these things to their children, although obviously parents certainly bear their own responsibilities to pass things on to children. But I also think that what we teach in our school systems is a reflective of our values as a society. And so I don't think it ought to rest entirely on the backs of parents. So how do we do this? I wish I knew the answer to that. I think we're at a moment right now where that, at least for now, is becoming more difficult rather than less difficult to do, which is really unfortunate, because I think for a long time, we were headed in a different direction, where people were becoming more receptive to the variety of experiences that Americans of many different backgrounds bring to bear on the story of the United States. And I wish I could be more optimistic. I don't feel like we're in a very optimistic moment for the teaching of this kind of history. And I hope that I'm wrong.
Well, we're going to be soon running out of time. You have some final comments about the book and that you might want to leave us with?
Nothing in particular. I really appreciate so much that people, this book came out almost 2 years ago, and the fact that people are still, interested in hearing about it and spending time thinking about it and have questions about it. I find that really very gratifying. It's a project that I thought was very important to talk about and to put in between the covers of a book. I really just hope that there are people who can, who find it meaningful to them to read it. I know it's a difficult read. I know for many people it's a personally painful thing to read about.
It certainly is that.
Yeah, no, it is. And I know that being willing to say, to pick something like that on purpose and read it and say, this is important to me, I need to understand this. I know how much that takes out of people to do. And so I'm really grateful to everyone on the call, to everyone who reads the book. If anyone has any additional questions that they didn't get to, or they want to ask me about, I'm easy to find on the University of Alabama website. Please drop me an email. I'd be happy to do what I can to get to things that we didn't get to tonight. But thank you all for your time.
Yeah, well, I want to say it's that reading the book is painful, but the book is such a book that once I picked it up, Josh, it was with me. It was like I can't leave this. I've got to keep going And I gotta tell you, there were certainly times when I was angry, might have shed a tear or so, but it's a great book. And thank you for providing us with the information, legacy, and the chain.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Louisiana Historical Association is most grateful to you for having spent these few moments with us this evening. Thank you, folks, for joining us. You have information now that will allow you to contact Dr. Rothman at your leisure if you have other questions and concerns about not only legacy and change, but some of his other work. So again, thank you so much. It's really been enjoyable, Don. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
I hope so. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night.